Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is always a pleasure to have you here. First and foremost, my name is Jack Mutante. I am the content manager here at Podcast Party. It's a fancy way of saying it's my job to figure out what goes on and what doesn't, right? But tonight we're going to go into our third episode of our series called Democracy Unplugged. This is where we call upon thought leaders to sit in a panel and discuss some of the more topical issues that we face in this country. And even from a global perspective, right? Because our previous one, we had the amazing Douglas Murray as one of our panelists, right? Podcast Party was started at the beginning of this year with an emphasis on open dialogue and critical thinking. And our North Star, Rena, over there, called me up and asked me to take part in it, and I jumped at the opportunity. And a couple of months later, we've got a few videos online that have caught the imagination of a lot of people across the globe. So, for this evening, we've got these three young men behind me who will be our panelists. First and foremost, we've got Phumlani Majozi, who is an outspoken commentator, analyst, as well as an author, and the name of his book is Lessons from the Past. Phumlani Majozi. Second up is a very familiar face. For those of you that are familiar with Burning Platform, he is one of our major contributors, and he is also an author. His book is named How to Fix South Africa. Second up on our panel, Mr. Kanthan Pillay. And last but not least, our moderator for the evening is a man who is very well known in political and social media. As far as that landscape is concerned, he's an academic, as well as, he taught me this word a little earlier on, an anesthesiologist. I got it right.
Yeah, well done.
There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Witt. And with that said, I will hand over to our moderator, Jonathan Witt. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Right, good evening, everyone. I need to write a book now because I'm the only one on stage without one. Unfortunately, Das Kapital is taken, so I'll have to come up with something else. Right, good evening, Phumlani and Kanthan. Thanks for being here and agreeing to do this. We haven't discussed what we're going to talk about because I'm not 100% sure. I said to Rena yesterday, I said, well, what are we discussing? And she said, well, whatever you want to discuss. So who knows where this could go with Kanthan? It's anyone's guess, really. Exactly. So let's start with the state of the world, because it seems to me things are a bit back to front. The head of public health is a software developer called Bill Gates. The head of the United States and the free world is a dementia patient by the name of Joe Biden. The heads of the banks don't believe in capital anymore. They believe in DEI. And so we have a world that's kind of very back to front currently. So what do you think is causing this shift in the entire structure, certainly in the West, in the world?
Are you starting with me, or?
Yeah, I'll go with you first, and then Phumlani can.
So let's start with a very controversial point. I think that the world right now is actually in a significantly better position than it ever has been in the history of the human race. And the reason why I say that is because of a couple of things, mainly driven by technology, primarily because access to information is at an unparalleled level in terms of human development. At the same time, access to information that is deliberately falsified is also very high, but we can park that aside. But what is true is that the ability of people to make informed decisions around how they live their lives is probably at the highest point that it's ever been. So if you break down what's happening in the world right now, particularly in terms of the relationships between the great powers, which is where the starting point around this is. There was a time not so long ago, and I will refer to the COVID bugbear, which was the starting point, where control of information was absolutely crucial to maintaining a narrative that then shaped people's behavior. And now that we have access to information, where people are able to themselves filter information and assign credibility scores in their own heads to that type of information, it means that the ability of all of these major powers to control the narrative and thereby controlling the destiny of the people is effectively been defanged. And that's why I say we're in a better space than we've ever been. It's a scary space because we see for the first time the nakedness of everything crumbling around us. But at the same time, particularly for those of us who are not intrinsically intertwined in that particular environment. So we're not in the US, we're not in Russia, we're in South Africa, but we're cushioned by the incompetence of our leaders, which gives us incredible power to actually take charge of our own destiny. So that's my starting point, John.
Phumlani, and feel free to respond to anything you feel was errant
offensive. No, I hasn't said anything offensive yet. Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to see you, sir. And it's great to see Kanthan as well, to be on the stage. I said, when I was telling these gentlemen, I said to them, the nice thing about being on stage is that I'm with the two men who met Nelson Mandela, right? And I've never done that. So what an honor. Okay, so for me, I think I will speak more from the economic side and the geopolitics, because I think that's of great concern to me at the moment. So, and boss, you spoke about the fact that you said central bankers no longer believe in capitalism. I think you used those words.
Cronyism for sure.
So I would say that yes, I agree with Kanthan that materially, there has been some good progress, no doubt. I mean, even Steven Pinker, the professor at Harvard, has written great books about that materially we are much, much better off, around the world, in terms of poverty, in terms of, technology, which is what Kanthan we are talking about. So that can't be disputed. But now we are seeing, given the nature of geopolitics and how things are shaping globally, it seems to me that the developing world, countries like South Africa and many in Africa as well, because of the geopolitics, how things are sort of shaping right now, where you basically, Professor Neil Ferguson, he has argued that we are already in Second World War, in Cold War II, right? In the sense that already that struggle between, China and the US is already taking place. Now, the big challenge for developing nations will be, how do they position themselves in such a global atmosphere? We are seeing what's happening in Ukraine, where China has said, look, we'll be, at least in my observation, they are more on the side of Russia. We are seeing what's happening in Israel as well. So you do see that global division, right, on geopolitics. Now, developing nations will, at least it seems, that they will be under pressure again, as we saw in the first Cold War, to try and align, at least at some point. It may not be now, but at some point, if this Cold War II that Professor Neil Ferguson, the historian, speaks about, if it does intensify, then the developing nations are going to face those pressures. Now, that would be hard to do in a country or in nations where you still have massive poverty rates, right? Where you still have even connectivity to power. Last time I checked Africa, I think about half of Africa's population has electricity, right? Just below half, in fact. So you still have these challenges. You still have, according to the World Bank not a long time ago, in Africa there is something that is concerning, and that is, it seems like when you look at over the past 30 years, really Africa has struggled to really suppress poverty, right? That Africa has struggled with that. Yes, there has been some decline in poverty, but it's very minimal in contrast to other regions like Southeast Asia, China as well. Africa has struggled with that. So imagine now you find yourself as a developing nation like Africa, which is called the next frontier, you're finding you have to now pick sides between whether you are siding with the cohort of nations led by China or a cohort of nations led by the West. So I'm concerned about that, Jonathan, that I think we're entering a phase where my greatest concern is we might be, we might really be entering a phase where Cold War II is taking shape, even with the technological struggle as well between China and Western nations. And that African nations will struggle, and that's going to slow down the pace of development. So for me, I would say the global economy, the geopolitics are much more concerning. The prospects are quite concerning to me because of how geopolitics are shaping.
Well, has Africa not made its decision already in that regard? We have Belt and Road Initiative from the Chinese, which has been up and running in Africa for several decades now. And most countries in Africa, maybe not all of them, but certainly at this point, at least 50% of them are some way beholden to China. We are included in that. We've taken some loans from them, and we certainly are in bed with them to a point. Is that not already a decision that's been made?
Well, you see, hence again, I think that's what's going to make even things harder for Africa. In fact, China is the biggest creditor of Africa, right? I mean, we really owe some big money to the Chinese. In fact, also China is the biggest trading partner of Africa, right? Even with South Africa as well. China is the first, and then we have USA as the second. So now...
Actually, USA is number 6, but we can talk about that.
Okay, stop that, Kanthan, for now. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Anyway, but I get to a point. My point is that China is right at the top. So imagine now, and by the way, you didn't mention the AGOA program, the United States AGOA program, used to really foster trade between Africa and the US. So there are other initiatives that the West is doing in Africa, but there hasn't been, Jonathan, a hard line where nations in Africa have to take a tough stance as to who do we side with, right? But I do agree with you that yes, China is heavily involved through loans and infrastructure programs in Kenya, Zambia, and so on. But we haven't reached a point where there has to be a stark or clear standing as to where nations stand. Not yet. And that's my concern, that if we get there, I mean, how are we going to untangle ourselves, given there's so much trade, relations we had with these regions.
Kanthan, any response to that?
So Phumlani is right that it is all about the economics, but we need to drill down into what that actually means around the economics. So the first thing that we need to understand is that in any society around the world, the Pareto principle applies, the 80-20 rule, and that is that 80% of the populace of the country have no say whatsoever in shaping the economy. Of the remaining 20%, there's 2% of the overall populace that ultimately are immune to any fluctuations that happen on a day-to-day basis in the economies of those societies. They are the ones who make decisions on an ongoing basis around how money flows and so forth. The 18 percentage points which are below them are taken up by the middle class, who effectively drive the economy on a day-to-day basis, primarily in terms of the bureaucracy and administration, and they are the ones who generally struggle on a day-to-day basis to make ends meet. But by and large, for the continent, the 80% of the populace, their lives have been unchanged for the past 100 years. And when I say they've been unchanged for the past 100 years, it means that they might have been minuscule improvements, but overall, they still are largely subsistence-based. But what that means is that they are immune to the fluctuations that actually happen on the global stage. I use, for example, the case of Zimbabwe, where by all accounts it should be a country where people are in a state of starvation. But you do have the sense that every single person who is able to has a small patch where they're growing mealies, where they're growing beans, and they're keeping chickens at home. And so as a result, it doesn't matter whether the flow of foreign currency is bad or good. Their lives remain unchanged on a day-to-day basis. So if we park that and then recognize that when we talk about fluctuations in economy, it relates very specifically to 20% of the populace. And the middle class in South Africa has been absolutely feeling the heat because of the fact that the rand-dollar exchange rate has actually collapsed. But now let's get back to the question of how do you determine the value of a country? So if you look at our figures for 2023, our GDP in official exchange rates in US dollar terms was $405 billion, which was down from $450 billion in the previous year. However, if you translate that to GDP as measured in purchasing power parity, okay, which is effectively how your lifestyle is affected based on a basket of goods, South Africa's economy throughout the entire period of the past 30 years has been on an upward trajectory, except for a brief downward dip during the time of COVID. So that's the first thing to understand, that irrespective of what our relationship might be with the United States or with Russia or with China, the overall effect on the quality of life of South Africans at the grassroots level is exactly the same. So if you understand that as a starting point, the decisions that we speak of in terms of whether we are aligning ourselves with the Western world or whether we are aligning ourselves with the BRICS countries doesn't really matter, because from the point of view of people on the ground, it doesn't affect them. But what is true is that we do need to look at where the trajectories have been. And there's a downward spiral in terms of the GDP in purchasing power parity of the Western countries, and there's been an upward tick in terms of the BRICS countries. And so for the first time last year, the BRICS countries have overtaken the G7 in terms of GDP. They're now sitting at 33% of global GDP versus 32% for the Western countries. The trajectory is upwards for the BRICS countries. So India is currently topping the charts globally in terms of economic growth. Most people are not aware of the countries that are actually outperforming the rest of the world. But India is up there, Indonesia is up there, Turkey is up there, Russia is up there, and the United States comes way down below. So out of the G7, only the United States and Japan have actually been growing. So the question of who we align ourselves with has to also take into account where the trends are going to be. Entrenching a trade relationship with a block of countries that are failing overall versus building relationships with where the growth points are going to be, that becomes the challenge that happens in terms of our foreign policy. But again, I'm saying it doesn't affect the lives of South Africans on a day-to-day basis.
No, I'm not sure, Kanthan, I would agree that it doesn't affect the lives of the people. Because when you look at the, and the greatest concern is the highest unemployment rate numbers that we have, which I'm sure you're also concerned about that. And we have the highest unemployment rate in the world, at least when compared to many markets. And that is, and by the way, that it's been clear post-1994 era that with strong economic growth, you also have lower levels of unemployment rates. We have seen that, right? So what I'm trying to say is that we need an environment that is sort of encourages economic productivity. I'm not talking about South Africa. I was talking about developing nations. I was speaking more about Africa as well. That you've got to have an environment where there is not that toxicity in terms of trade relations, geopolitics, because that affects in terms of trade and economic productivity as well, and that affects the employment trends. And South Africa's challenge right now, which I think is the biggest challenge along with the crime crisis, that Roman has been very much vocal about the crime issue, all those factors, they do affect employment rates, and we can't ignore. And the most affected by employment rates are ordinary people on the ground. So when you say people are not impacted by the economic dynamics and the decisions we have to make in terms of trade and so on, I don't think I would agree with that because of the employment crisis we have.
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting point you make because we're 2 months, less than 2 months from an election. And the big argument from anyone who's not the ANC is that the country is way worse off than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Which is absolutely the case for the middle class, to my point.
Yes, but you're saying it's not the case for anyone below
And
the
I'm
middle
saying
class.
for the 80% of the populace in this country, or for most countries in the world, those numbers actually don't matter, because it is that middle class, that 18% of the populace, that is affected by things like hikes in interest rate, car payments, mortgage payments. You're paying for private security, you're paying for medical aid. All of these things they're fundamentally middle class problems. And the failure for us to actually recognize that middle class problems are not necessarily the problems of the country. And the extent to which we can persuade the 80% of the populace that it is in their interests to actually be concerned about the problems that actually affect the middle class is going to determine whether or not we're going to successfully be able to achieve those things you're talking about: economic growth, reducing the unemployment rate. Right now, there isn't anything that's actually pointing away to an incentive for people to extricate themselves from poverty, because for 80% of the populace, that has been the default case. What they have seen during the course of the past 30 years is they have seen an uptick in terms of the number of schools in their areas. Admittedly, they're completely dysfunctional from our point of view, but there are schools that didn't exist previously. They do suddenly have access to healthcare facilities, again, highly dysfunctional, but they're primary healthcare facilities that were not there. And so actually trying to persuade those people that their lives are worse than it was 30 years ago is really a tough sell. Now, for those of us who actually inhabit this middle class stratum, it's very clear to us that our quality of life in real money terms, which is if you take the money that you earn in rands and convert it to US dollars, which then translates to your ability to travel to the world, yes, there's been a measurable impact on our quality of life. But I'm saying our failure to recognize, and at a political level, none of the political parties have actually been able to wrap their heads around this. None of them. That until you're able to come up with ideas that are going to resonate with that 80% of the masses, the world is going to continue pretty much on the trajectory we are right now. It's not likely to change. And that's the level at which I'm speaking to you, Phumlani.
No,
it's not dismissing in any way all of the points you're making.
Get your arguments. But now, again, that's I think, given this segment of the conversation, there is also a very important issue that we need to touch on. And it's more about now, whether you agree with what Kanthan is saying or you agree with me, but the main thing here is about how do we get reform right, economic reform, right, to address the socio-economic challenges that we are facing. Because it boils down to that. And I've held a view for a while, and along with many people, including Lesega Kganyago, the chair of the Reserve Bank, that much of our problems are more structural, right? So if you address the needs of the very destitute people in the country, the people who are facing challenges in townships and so on, we all have to deal with the problems of educational challenges, we have to deal with the problems of labor reforms, and you've commented on that a lot when it comes to the issues of labor reforms that we need. We have to deal with the problems of legislation as well, the regulations in the country, the tax codes, the tax reforms that we have to deal with. So what's happening in South Africa is that much of the socio-economic that have repressed economic growth to address the needs of the unfortunate people or people at the bottom has been very much, we have been lacking on that, right? Hence again, it touches on the question of how do we address the 80% that we are talking about in your perspective. And I think that reform, even the energy reform as well. And I'm beginning to think that it's now that the Ramaphosa's administration has, at least by liberalizing the energy market, I think they've done, although of course there are things I would have loved them to do.
What have they done to liberalize the energy market?
No, I'm sorry,
They've given it to Motsepe. Is that
yeah, well, I'm talking about the opening of the market in the sense that we allow now private institutions either to,
owned by their brother-in-law, yes. I mean, where is the liberalization of this market? The liberalization of this market would imply that the hundreds of thousands of South Africans who've invested in solar panels would be able to pump their energy back into the grid. That remains an impossibility under the current regulations. There is no reform. I get worried when I hear words like economic reform because it implies that the government controls the economy. And it's a complete misunderstanding of how economies work. Economies are not controlled. If you try to control them, you make them worse, not better. This is the entire problem with central planning.
Xi Jinping disagrees with you.
Well, Xi Jinping, I don't think he would disagree that much, to be honest, given that he embraced the American approach, but without labor laws. But the thing is that we saw this in COVID. We can decide what is an essential service and what isn't an essential service, and everything will be fine. And we lost several thousands of businesses that never came back. Drive down the road here and you can see the Hyatt Regency used to employ hundreds of people, and through all the different businesses that were connected to it, thousands. All of those people lost their jobs, never to come back again. Okay, and that has happened repeatedly through the restaurant industry, through the tourism industry, through all those industries that were not essential.
And John, this is to my point. For the 80% of the populace, they have not been affected by any of those things you speak of.
Well, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. Firstly, because there are some countries in which the middle class is the 80%. Okay, so the developed West, for example, that's the entire goal, is to get a country where you end up with 80% being the middle class, so to speak. And so when that middle class starts to falter, like it is in the United States, which will have significant repercussions on the election coming up, then that middle class does start to have an impact, and they do start to get grumpy, and they do change their political focus. I'm not convinced that the guy who was the doorman at the Hyatt, who is now unemployed and unable to find work because we don't have a growing economy, I'm not convinced that he hasn't been affected negatively. And I think that there are many examples
which is what
of
I've been
that.
saying, that the employment pattern.
So I think...
But I mean, what's your point, Jonathan? You say that the economy is not controlled by the government. What are you trying to say?
The economy is definitely interfered with by the government. And you can have various political philosophies on whether you agree with that interference and how much interference that should be. Essentially, that's all, from an economic perspective, that's all the different philosophies believe in. Some believe in complete control. They want government to control it entirely. Some believe in zero control, and some believe in some sort of medium, right? And one of the problems we have in South Africa is we respond to our problems by saying more government intervention rather than government walk away. And I think that is a particular challenge that we face. But I do want to...
I agree with you on that, by the way,
yeah,
which is what I'm trying to...
I think we have similar political philosophies in that regard. And I hear you when you say reform. I don't think you're being obtuse about that. When you talk about labour reform, I'm sure all of us on stage feel that the minimum wage, for example, is an issue. And that's something that could be reformed, for example. The ability to hire and fire is a major issue in this country. If you've ever owned a business, you will know that. But, you've got to be careful about saying, well, we need the government to sort this out. We have had the government sorting problems out in this country for close on 100 years now, 80 at least. And they've done irreparable damage to this country and to many of the people in it.
Just to be clear, by the way, when I say government should sort it out, I'm not saying that government must sort it out by, doing more and intervening. I'm saying that there must be relaxation of regulations. We've spoken about the minimum wage laws. There must be, I strongly believe in reforming education, because one of the problems we face is that we don't have competitive education. And
see, I don't think we've got an education problem. The problem we have is that we allow the government to control education.
Yeah, whatever, if you
call
that a problem.
See, words matter. The words matter, and the language is very important. In fact, it's where I wanted to go to next, which is information. You spoke about good information and bad information. We have hate speech acts coming up all over the world. It's now J.K. Rowling might be a wanted woman in Scotland for being transphobic. We have similar legislation in this country going through Parliament. People who get to decide what is hate and what isn't. Because 40 years ago what was hate is now considered to be liberal, and now what's considered to be liberal is considered or is a reverse. So in other words, you've had a complete. You'd be very careful who you make the guardians of hate.
But again, John,
okay?
I'm going to go to the point that these are middle class problems. I'm 100% with you.
No, I'm going to get to where it's not a middle class problem.
I'm 100% with you in terms of freedom of speech,
sure,
and all of these issues that you're talking about. But for the 80% of the populace, those things actually don't matter. What actually does matter is that when we're looking at how the world actually shapes itself and how economic decisions get made, we fail to actually take into account the impact of why local cultures developed the way they did in terms of the economy, and why it becomes really difficult to course correct against that backdrop. The thing that I use as an example all the time is that Western civilization was built on a very simple concept, which is ham and cheese. And I refer to ham and cheese simply because ham and cheese represent the single biggest thing that actually led to the development of Western civilization. What do ham and cheese represent? It's actually storing food for the times that you are not able to obtain food, which is the winter. So in Europe, for most of Northern Europe, if you do not spend the warm summer months preparing for the cold winter months, you will die, literally, because there is no way that you will survive it. So you have to become culturally acclimatized over probably millennia in terms of preparing for those harsh winter months, which means that you're stockpiling fuel, as in firewood, you are stockpiling grain, you're harvesting the grain and stockpiling the grain, and then you take ham is curing your meat for those months. Cheese, again, is preserving your dairy for those months, and the cycle repeats itself. Now, you take rural KwaZulu-Natal. Even in the harshest winter that you might have in rural KwaZulu-Natal, you will not freeze to death if you are sleeping out in the open. And even in the harshest winter in rural KwaZulu-Natal, you will find something to eat, because there's an abundance of greenery, there is an abundance of wildlife. For snakes, for example, are really good eating, and you'll find that in many parts of KZN, they will actually end up eating them. So, to my point, if you are trying to impose economic challenges to people who don't need that for their basic survival, is an entirely different paradigm that applies to the Western world, that applies to the African world. When we have a situation where we have migrants who come to South Africa and they set up spaza shops, and they essentially, it's a one shack operation. The entire family lives in the shack, they sleep under the counter, the husband is managing behind the counter, the wife is working the till, and that becomes their entire cycle. And then you try and persuade our fellow South Africans that they need to be getting to the spaza shop market. And they were saying, no, why would I want to do that? You know, is my quality of life going to be improved by my doing this? So when we're applying these economic paradigms that we speak about in terms of how lives are affected on a day-to-day basis in the Western world, and then try and apply that to our day-to-day lives as the 80% of South Africans, it goes completely over their heads, and they have no connection with it whatsoever.
Kanthan, how does that explain our employment rate 20 years ago? So those people suddenly don't care anymore.
I'm saying that for the people who are on the ground at the 80% level, remember that overall...
But some of those 80% were working 20 years ago.
Yes, but...
Then we made very bad decisions around all kinds of things, mining, electricity,
okay, so let's be very clear about one thing. The overall number of people that are employed today is greater than the overall number of people that were employed in 1994.
Yeah, but
okay,
so
we understand this, okay?
Effects.
Now, the reason why this is important, and this is where the numbers actually become important, is because the population growth rate has exceeded the growth rate of the economy. But so, but
the
what
economy,
that means,
or the economy productivity has underperformed population growth.
I'm very happy to accept that. But by the same token, what I'm saying is that, so in actual numbers, the number of people who are employed has actually been on a consistent upward trend. But when you drill down to it as a percentage of the populace, because the populace is growing at such a massive rate, and again, one of the reasons why the populace is growing at such a massive rate is we don't have the imperatives that Europeans have, where they can't afford to have more children, just simply because of the fact that it's unaffordable from an economic perspective. In South Africa, that's not the case.
Why?
Simply because of the fact that the ability to be able to feed a family of 6 on an income of a couple of $100 a month in the rural areas in South Africa is actually quite achievable. Ditto in the case of, I mean, let's use the Israel-Palestine conflict right now. And you look in terms of...
Our audience is rumbling because they're coming for you.
I understand that they're coming for me. But look, if you look in terms of the Palestinian population rate, they've been outpacing the Israelis by a significant factor.
Got to bring Palestine into it when we're about to close this
I'm
part of the
just saying
session.
that Israel has middle-class problems and the Palestinians don't. And if you understand that economic difference...
Here's what I'm keen to hear from you, Kanthan. So are you saying, because you seem to emphasize to me that population growth has, which is what we've just mentioned, that it's outperformed economic growth. So, and then, are you saying that should we have mechanisms to, from a public policy point of view, to somehow incentivize people not to have kids or to suppress population growth? How do you handle that? Well, it seems to me that you are saying population growth has been an issue.
No, I'm saying that population growth is not an issue. And it's not an issue because the quality of life of the people that are experiencing the population growth has not experienced material change. Whereas from the point of view of those of us who have, generally there are 2 breadwinners in the family and there are 2 kids per household, and the quality of life that we have has declined significantly during the time of
now
the past 2 administrations.
Let me raise something else, which is a counter to what he's saying. What's happened, and it's going to touch on you, because you made a point about GDP size, right? The size of the economy. Because what's happened is that our GDP per capita has been on the decline over the past, since 2007, right? No, yes, it has been.
Not in purchasing power parity, in US dollar terms. But again, if you're going to look in terms of US dollar terms, you need to understand the way in which the global financial system works and the entire structures that underpin the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. And you realize that it's actually the biggest con in the history of the human race. Because the United States is the only country in the world that has the ability to print money without recourse. So if you understand that as the basic premise, it also means that the United States is then able to set the value of currencies of the rest of the world. So a point that I will raise, that I have a very close family member who lives in London, and he and his wife have very high profile middle class jobs, and they they bought a two-door house that's Tudor, not a house with 2 doors, in Teddington, which they are refurbishing, but their lives are very constrained at a fundamental level. So, for example, they only eat chicken once a week. They're not able to afford red meat. And if they do end up eating fish, they generally end up eating fish out of cans. Okay, now if I look in terms of my lifestyle, in rand terms, if you translate my money into pounds, I probably earn 10% of what they do. However, I eat red meat on a daily basis. I'm able to have a bottle of wine on a daily basis. And I have a quality of life that they can only dream of. And that's why I say that when you measure things in US dollar terms, it's a con, because the Biden administration has printed more money during his term than was ever printed in the history of the United States. It's just basically been cranking out the printing presses. The way in which the exchange rates are set for the pound and for the euro is the US sets those exchange rates. And they do this by means of currency swaps. So the US will agree that the British will give them X number of pounds in exchange for X number of dollars. But what that means is that the United States effectively has complete control over those economies, which is why when Liz Truss tried to mess with the fundamentals of the UK economy by bringing a Ghanaian financial minister who wanted to actually completely rip out the underpinnings of the way in which that economy is structured, the US immediately moved in and crushed the pound because they get to determine it. So when you talk about GDP, purchasing power parity is the only measure that matters because it's lifestyle of people on the ground.
So just one thing to mention, Kanthan, because it seems, because I don't want us to, at least from my view, to somehow be on the defensive mode and dismiss the fact that we have some serious economic challenges in this country, including very much important, the very high unemployment rate that largely affects the people on the ground. And many of them who, even when you look at the levels of, people don't have skills. They face a serious challenge in the country.
This is the information point I wanted to bring up, because you are quoting World Bank and you're quoting sort of these statistics about our terrible unemployment rate and all these things. And it appears to me that unemployment rate must be false. Okay, so I understand that employment rate is what the formal sector, what Standard Bank and
so saying
those kinds of companies report.
Should be more.
And what SARS is picking up as PAYE, etc., etc. But it appears to me that you could not have 50% of this country unemployed and all of them surviving on 350 Rand. And it's not even all of them because we pay out, 21, what is Cyril proud of? 21 million grants, whatever it is.
It's 28 now, I think.
Is it 28? All right. So 28 million people get 350 or thereabouts, maybe a little bit more if it's one of the other grants. And everyone is surviving on that. Doesn't seem, even taking Kanthan's point about rural areas and food costs, it doesn't seem to me that everyone's surviving on that. So there's a thriving informal economy, and we actually know this because we know that there's billions of rands which exchanges hands without going through the formal economy, certainly in the townships. And so what I was trying to get to with regards to information is we use a lot of these metrics which are given to us by these authorities. And I'm just wondering if we need to question some of that. And what do you think about that?
I wasn't Kanthan.
No, I'm asking you because you like the figures. I know you like the figures. You like what the World Bank says. You like it. You like these figures, and I understand that. And these are the figures that have a lot of sway and play in mainstream media. Certainly, in what the average person on the street reads in their newspaper or on their online app, if they're willing to pay that exorbitant rate for news. But I'm not sure I believe those figures.
Jonathan. Well, I'm telling you what is being said by official institutions. If you can
I know, but Phumlani, in fairness, official institutions said you had a 90% chance of dying of COVID 3 years ago this week. Okay, now look at this room.
No,
okay.
I get your point. We make a very
all
good
died
point.
and got to heaven.
Sure.
Welcome.
In fact, I tend to be more on your side.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that I cannot use use some imaginary statistics. I would rather use what is there. Do I believe that could be accurate? Of course, it could not be accurate. Some of it. When you look at, the things like employment rates, unemployment rates, even the way these things are calculated, even poverty as well, how poverty is calculated. In fact, economist Thomas Sowell always says that whatever poverty is, it's what the state, when it comes to official statistics, it's what statisticians tell you and politicians. There are other ways of looking at what it can be or what it's called, what poverty is. So should we be sort of be wary of statistics from these organizations? Of course we should. And we should take them with a pinch of salt. That is fine. But from my side, I'm just telling you what is out there. So there could be inaccuracies. But for now, it may not be something for me to determine. You shouldn't just take everything.
It's just a question of whether we take that, how seriously we take those figures and then how we interpret them.
So we should be careful, is what we're saying.
I need to open it up to the floor. I'm getting sign language from everyone. We did. Kanthan's a runaway train, everyone.
He is.
This is what happens when you've had a lot of time to look at all this data.
Rena serves great wine. What can I say?
So I'm going to open it up to the floor. The only rule is that you have to have a microphone to speak. If you don't have a microphone, then we won't hear you.
Seems like we spoke more about the economy. Yeah?
We did talk, but we can talk about other things. I wanted to get into other topics, but we didn't get there, but we can now. We've got a fair amount of time for questions. So if there are questions, then let's start over here.
I have a question for all three of you. Regarding the economy in particular. You mentioned, Kanthan, that the government they've been trying to create jobs for the longest of times, but one thing they're not doing is building the economy itself. So I just wanted you to break that down for us. Like, how can the government build up the economy?
So the quick answer to that is...
To address the 80% people who've been telling
No,
us
I'm
about.
not going to address the 80% because really, you see, the issue we must understand, firstly, in terms of economic growth and employment and job creation relates to the 20%, which is significant out of 55 million people. So let's park the 80% for a while. The impediments that government puts in to economic growth are what matters. Governments, as Jonathan has pointed out, and Phumlani, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, are incapable of creating jobs. What government can do is get out of the way and minimize the impediments that currently exist to people being able to freely trade with each other. And so the four biggest things that, to my mind, currently impede our economic growth are minimum wage, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act, and broad-based black economic empowerment. Because they all impose artificial constraints upon the ability of people to do business freely with each other. So at the most fundamental level, I keep using this example in terms of minimum wage, and we can extrapolate around the rest when we have more time, but right now, just in terms of minimum wage, I use the example of, let's say, a single mother who's living in Alexandra Township who gets her first job. And the first job ends up paying something like 6,000 Rand a month. In order for the single mother to take that job, she has a child that needs to be looked after. Right now, in terms of our labor laws, she has to hire a caregiver to look after the child, who has to then earn minimum wage, which is going to be pretty much half of her salary. Now, down the road from her, she's got a neighbor who is willing to look after this child for 800 Rand a month. But the government says that she's not allowed to do that. Now, this, to my mind, is fundamentally immoral. If you look in terms of defining any framework of morality for a country, that's a fundamental level of immorality, because you are denying the right of the individual to exchange their labor at a rate that they are comfortable exchanging it for. So if you eliminate that single impediment and you allow people to be able to decide among themselves what is the value that they want to place upon their own efforts, you will find the economy flying. So government's job is not to create jobs. The role of government should be to get out of the way.
Comment on how the government goes about creating economic growth.
Yeah, what
Not
he has
necessarily
said,
just jobs, though.
Yeah, it's just that if he says the same thing, I mean, it's to add what he say, which I think those are very good points, and I totally agree with them, Kanthan. And there is also one thing that I would add to what Kanthan is saying. Much of some of the problems we face, we have what's called, we are not producing really enough skills, that are competitive and that are able to address some of the job sort of requirements that are needed in the country. I think we need to get our education right as well. We need education that's entrepreneurial. And by the way, this thing of educating young people to be employed, I think we need to really take a shift in that culture. How do we produce an education system that fosters a culture of being entrepreneurs, people to be entrepreneurs, to get out of the education system and start something, then to think about how they are going to find jobs. So I think we need to change the culture for education as well. It's not about competitive education and producing people or young people who are skilled enough to be able to get the jobs that are out there that require sophisticated skills, but it's also about, how do we, to foster that entrepreneurial spirit. And when people say, well, I've seen this argument a few times where people say, well, it's because, there isn't enough funding to fund entrepreneurs and all that. I just think there is a lot of funding out there that could be tapped into, whether it's from the private sector and to an extent some government as well. But the problem is that we don't have that strong culture of entrepreneurship to cultivate it from the school level upward.
Why do you like the idea of entrepreneurship so much? See, I have a problem with it. This seems to be a big focus. Whenever people talk about jobs and economies, and then they seem to default to entrepreneurs. And for every Elon Musk, there's about 100,000 worker bees. Okay? That's just how the world works.
Elon employs all of them.
That's just how the world works. The world works that the majority of people are going to work for someone. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's also been this demeaning that's happened over time of general employment. The same as there's been demeaning of the nuclear family. So if you're a woman who stays home to look after the kids, that's seen to be less than if you're a woman who goes out into the work world. Except that your greatest contribution to the earth will be those children, not how many hours you spent in your HR job or whatever it is you do. So I'm not understanding why we focus on that. To me, if you said to me, look, we can create 30 million entrepreneurs in South Africa, or we can give people 30 million jobs, we can find a way to get to 30 million jobs. I would go with the 30 million jobs and not have any entrepreneurs, even if that meant they all work for the same guy or girl. And because at the end of the day, there's got to be fewer chiefs than there are Indians. And so I'm not convinced on the entrepreneurial side of things. I think certainly education is a part of things, but you can teach people to be anything. And we need lots of tradesman stuff in this country, frankly. I don't know if you've noticed, there's no water in Johannesburg and no electricity on a regular basis. People who know how to fix pipes properly so that they don't reburst every 3 days would be a great thing to have. Now, apparently we don't have that. Eskom, this is a known problem. Part of Eskom's issues are that they fired a whole bunch of people who had worked there for 20 or 30 years and who really, really knew how those systems worked and who knew where all the wires went. And they just said to them, look, we don't really need you guys anymore.
And BE, but there was a
obviously there were contributing factors. But the point is that's what they did, and they lost all that institutional knowledge. And nobody really wants to be the guy on the ground getting his hands dirty, because that's not a good thing to be doing, even though we all know that plumbers are very wealthy people and you can make a good living in a lot of trades. And certainly in a country like ours, I don't know where people think we're going to go to. We are not going to be Singapore tomorrow. We could be Singapore in the future. It took Singapore 50 years to get to where they are. But we are first going to have to take a relatively poorly educated, and it's terrible that that's the fact, but it's a relatively poorly educated population. We're going to have to take that population through jobs that are not the most high-skilled jobs. It's going to take decades to educate people in skills, to get people up to the levels we talk about where we dream of having a country that looks like Singapore, or looks like even China, or resembles the European Union. So I just think that we must be careful on that particular point. In terms of your economic growth question, I agree. The government needs to get more out of the way. There's a lot of stuff just standing in the way. Those of you who are in business know this. If you try to do anything, if you release a contract, You have to do certain things. Why? Why do you have to do those things? Because the law says so. Because some politicians, most of whom have never held a job in their lives, tell you that's a good idea. Because it seems like a good idea when it gets explained to them on paper. But they've never been in a business to see that actually this is just going to create a lot of red tape for me, and I'd rather just hire who I want to hire, deal who I want to deal with, etc. So
just one thing to add on, both you've touched on the legislation and as well regulations. One of the, and I'm not sure if you've been following this, Kanthan, the rate of delisting at JSE, and part of this sort of a troubling trend of many companies delisting from JSE. The requirements, they've been quite cumbersome for many of those companies around compliance requirements, regulations, and all that. As a result, they've pulled out from JSE as a place where they can raise capital, right? So if we are going to, so that can pose challenges. So it's things like that. I think we need to get right as well, because if we are going to create an environment where it's hard for people to comply and it's costly, I think that is very problematic. So that's one example of what regulations and what's called compliance requirements from government, what that can do.
But again, we need to actually ask ourselves, why do we want to do that? Why is it desirable to have a stock exchange that becomes the primary means of raising funding? And I don't think people actually get their heads around that particular question. So let's park that thought and let's go
So for Kanthan, I think you are romanticizing this idea of what happens to the 80%, and using Zimbabwe as an example. In 2001, in South Africa, there was 16.1% of immigrants were from Zimbabwe, and in 2022, it was 48.5.
Sorry, just repeat those numbers for me so that I can.
16.1, 2001.
16.1% of what?
Of the immigrant population in South Africa was.
Which is how many people?
Less than 1 million, because the number now is over.
So 160,000 Zimbabweans in South Africa. Okay.
And
Thank you. Carry on.
2022, 48.5 out of 2.2 million.
Okay.
So that's a massive exodus of people who are predominantly now working as domestic workers, according to Stats SA, farm workers, that kind of thing. And today, President of Zimbabwe announced that 2.7 million people are going to be in need of food aid because of the impact of El Nino, but also the impact of just his bad administration. So the question is...
Just back off for a second. Where do you hear that? Because
he announced it on TV today.
He announced it on TV because let's be very clear that Zimbabwe, for the past agricultural year, has had the greatest crop in the history of the country, even higher than it was during the Rhodesian-Smith regime.
That's what the ZANU-PF said when they were campaigning.
And over and above that, there has also been...
Where did you get those stats?
So, but here's the question.
Where did you get those stats?
So that number about the bumper harvest was just a campaign number that has now been
I disagree, because again, those were internationally traded numbers.
Well, the guy just made an announcement today. But that's not the question, because if you focus purely on the agricultural output,
I'm pulling a Douglas Murray on it because he's presenting a false fact.
No, it's not a false fact.
And you can't use a false fact to then justify a line of reasoning.
Well, let's hear what his point is.
So I think that the Douglas Murray reverse Jedi here is there's no fact that is cited by the Zimbabwean government which should ever take at face value.
Yes, but I did not take that from the Zimbabwe. I do not trust the Zimbabwean
But that's where the numbers came from.
Not at all.
The bumper harvest numbers came from the ZANU-PF government, and when were distributed through various propaganda outlets and then became accepted. But now he's announced that there's going to be this famine, etc. So the point that I wanted to push back on is fundamentally that you have this conception that all of these developments, be they political, geopolitical, do not affect these people in a meaningful way. But what we can see from the very case study that you articulated is that the rural poor of Zimbabwe have had their lives totally upheaved as a result of the developments of the last 20 years. It's not like they're just sitting in huts, farming and drinking water. I said it's unchanged. It's drastically changed. And the statistics, the facts that you can't ignore are the ones that indicate that there's been this mass immigration from 100,000 to over 1 million, using the official numbers, which are not the full numbers. So I would like for you to respond to that, and to also ask you, why do you think that's even something that we should accept as a default, that in Africa, 80% of 1.6 billion people should just kick rocks and farm and just let history go by? So that's for you. And for you, Jonathan, is this question around role of the state. You have a view on liberalization of the market, but it seems to me that you also think that the state has no role in natural monopolies as well as public goods. And I think that view is one that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Case in point, if you look at Thames Water, which was privatized in the 90s, in the UK now, everybody is complaining about shit in the water and in the river, excuse my French, because of the shareholders of Thames Water being unwilling to make the necessary investments in the natural monopoly, because those investments to keep up the water quality are prohibitively expensive and chow profits. And what we're seeing, the conversation in the last 2 weeks, is that they are considering nationalizing Thames Water again and bailing it out for hundreds of billions of pounds, simply because of that privatization experiment not working. So your view seems to be that it's okay to have natural monopolies privately owned, and also that the state should have no role in education, which is a public good, even though the top educated countries, Denmark and France, whatever, are all free public education countries. How do you reconcile your view of the general market, where I do think you do need to have competition and, let's say, less regulation, and spaces such as public goods and natural monopolies? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
So John, you've got an hour to answer that question, and we'll take a break and we'll come back. So I'm just going to drill down to one very specific thing here, which is the question of people leaving Zimbabwe and coming to South Africa, and also relate that to a global context. And one of the important things we need to understand in terms of entrepreneurship is that only 2% of any given populace are entrepreneurs. Let's be very clear about that. We are not individually hardwired to be entrepreneurs, because we are not individually wired to be risk takers. The percentage of the populace that are wired mentally to be risk takers is very small. To become a successful entrepreneur, not only do you need to be part of the 2%, but then you also need to persuade a significant number of people to then follow your lead, and then to adopt the service that you are selling or the idea that you are promoting, and that's how the law of diffusion of innovation works. The reason why we have a high degree of people coming into this country, because they are primarily the risk takers from the other country, who see for themselves that they can get a better quality of life than they have wherever they are by going to a place where they're able to exercise their skills more freely. And there's a compounding effect that happens from this, because when you have entrepreneurial families, they in turn tend to breed entrepreneurial families. So you'll note, for example, the success of the Indian diaspora in completely overwhelming the tech industry in the United States. You look in terms of all of the major tech companies in the United States, and they all have CEOs from the Indian diaspora. Why is that? It's because their parents came across basically as entrepreneurs, invested in their development, and they end up entrenching themselves. In exactly the same way in South Africa, we have Zimbabweans who have come across here, who have seen there are South Africans who are not willing to be plumbers, they're not willing to be electricians, and there's relatively easy money to be made in terms of being able to send money back home to Zimbabwe, and so they do it. So the point being that if there was an economic environment in Zimbabwe that was not curtailing the ability of people to move their money freely. And Zimbabwe is an interesting case, because if you use World Bank figures, and if you track Zimbabwe's economic growth over the past 10 years in US dollar terms versus South Africa's economic growth in US dollar terms, as a percentage, Zimbabwe is outperforming South Africa.
From a low base, though.
It doesn't matter. okay? Because the percentages actually do matter at the end of the day. So the point being that simply using the one measure of the number of people who are traveling to other places in order to be able to strike out a living, that is not an objective measurement, because the overall impact in terms of what they're able to do is huge. Think of it, think of the scenario that we had during the entire apartheid era, where you had migrant workers who moved from the rural areas, who worked in the mines, and who sent money back home. And the Zimbabwean example is not very different. It's people who come from Mozambique to work in this country because this is where those opportunities actually exist. So I'm saying that that should not be conflated with how well a particular country is doing. People will go to where the opportunities are. Elon Musk could never have done the type of thing that he does by continuing to stay in South Africa. Just impossible. Ditto in the case of David Sachs, who was his colleague in PayPal. You look in terms of South African artists who left the country to end up building a new career in the West.
Yeah, but Kanthan, I mean, you can't dispute the fact that there were some serious problems that made, he used the word exodus of people in the thousands moving into South Africa. They were running away from something.
And how many hundreds of thousands of South Africans have left South Africa to work in the rest of the world? I know that Roman could probably quote those figures immediately because he's been going into them to some extent.
So are you saying that there were no socio-economic dynamics in Zimbabwe that forced people to
I'm saying that the percentage of the populace, remember we're talking 2% of 55 million people who end up being risk takers, and yes, that'll be hundreds of thousands of people who end up then leaving South Africa because they are risk takers and they want to set up lives in other countries. We shouldn't disparage the fact that people should be free to make these choices. People should be free to make those choices. I would really rather that we have a scenario where we are creating a situation in our country where people don't want to leave. But you have the bulk of stuff to answer.
But just one thing, if I can, which is a bit of a, to examine what he's saying, what we could also do is to take those percentage changes from the, I think you said from early 2000s up until recently, and compare to the previous same period to see if it's the same number, so that you can determine the trend, whether is it something that makes any sense, or is there some things that could have sort of reshaped them, you know, to
I mean, our more interesting
change.
part of his question, if you don't mind, is that, not the one to me, but the one to you, is regarding that 80%. I mean, I do have a bit of a problem with that. I'm not saying your description is necessarily incorrect, but the reality is it's not okay to just look at that 80% and go, well, they have nothing and they're fine with nothing, so such is, oh well, we just move on, right?
Yeah, and that's what I've been struggling with Kanthan.
You're being disingenuous here. Right?
Okay,
I never suggested that we should just move on.
Yeah.
What I am suggesting is that our failure to recognize that unless you're able to give an incentive to that 80%.
Okay.
And
I believe in incentives
we're not doing
completely, which is my answer to your question, essentially. Incentives. So the main thing people seem to misunderstand, it seems to me to be a global problem, is that the only thing humans are driven by ultimately is incentives. And the flip side of that coin is accountability. So you give people reason to chase for something, and they will. And the only thing that will stop them or prevent them from doing certain things outside whatever boundaries you have drawn will be accountability. Now, if you talk about the government owning public goods or natural resources and the ability to distribute those, that may work. It works in many countries. It worked in this country for many years under the previous regime and under the current regime. So electricity, water, etc. And there are arguments to be made that you could have those as part of the government, or you could have them as private entities. The issue really isn't whether it's run by the government or whether it's run by the private sector. The reason why in the UK that is going on is because there is no consequence for the directors of those companies who are ultimately delivering E. coli laced water into the homes of the British people. Just as they tried to privatize the rail sector, which has worked perfectly fine in many other countries, but didn't work there because there was no consequence for the fact that trains always arrive late, are constantly cancelled, etc. So the reality is governments can run things and private sector can run things. I'm not necessarily completely against the idea that government runs certain things. So for example, large distribution networks like water, like electricity, may be too complex, certainly once you have an established country, to try and then broaden out into the private sector. I'm not convinced that that's the case, but it may be the case. And so then you may want government to run it, but you would want some consequence. We have no consequence in this country for the failing infrastructure. Right? Certainly I'm not running for any office and I don't intend to be in any near future. But if I was going to get into government and I was going to be running this country tomorrow, I would do what MBS did with Saudi Arabia, which is that the minute I came to power, all the people who've been part of the destruction would be locked up. Simple. And no problem, they can have a court case somewhere down the line. 10 years, how long does it take to get into court in this country? Something like that. The problem is consequence. And the entire idea of capitalism or the free market, because unfortunately those words, capitalism, become a bit of a poisonous word, but the entire idea of the free market is that there are incentives. But the entire idea of society is that there are consequences for certain types of behavior or accountability. And there has been a complete unmooring of incentives and accountability across the entire world. South Africa is not unique in this in any way whatsoever. So we have leadership across the world who do things which are completely unacceptable, which the majority of populations on a referendum, which they never allow to happen, you'll notice, they would disagree with. But nothing happens to them. We have American presidents bombing civilians, no big deal, right? We have the French invading Libya and leaving it to warlords. No consequence for that, okay? We have NATO causing untold trouble in the east of Europe that then causes a brutal dictator to react, and as a result we have a wiped out nation. The Ukrainians will probably never recover from this.
Why are you calling Zelensky a brutal dictator? Really?
So unfair. All right. So that's my answer to your question. It's not an absolute no. I'm not a lolbertarian, as I've now called them. I don't believe the state must completely take away. And even when I talk about regulations, I don't think all regulations must disappear. But I just think a lot of them are poorly thought out. And certainly when you have a country like ours, that the one thing that would improve the 80%, which I definitely would like to see happen, the one thing that would improve the lives of those people is a lot of deregulation, just getting out of their way so that we could all start trading money with each other, building businesses, selling goods and creating value. I think that would be a great start. Okay. Ramon.
Yeah, just a question for all three of you, of course. So Kanthan, if we take what you say as correct, 80% of the people have a populist sort of high type preference, have been the same for 100 years. 2% are the elites who are the tail wagging the dog of the 80%, and the 18% in this room struggling to make ends meet. It's within the incentive of the 2% to suck us dry for the benefit of the 80% through redistribution. The political incentive, therefore, is for the 80% to vote for charterist parties, the EFF, the ANC, the MK parties, who will suck us dry, which keeps the elite in power and keeps the 80%, well, it's their democratic right to vote. What are the forces here where we can say, does the middle class have a role to play in the future of South Africa, or are we just here to, as a leeching pin for both sides of the equation, which we are not part of?
The short answer, Roman, is that we need to grow the middle class, because that's the only way you affect the balance of power. The difficulty is that the ability to grow the middle class is constrained by the 2%. How do we actually work our way around that? We don't have enough numbers in terms of the middle class out here to be able to do that.
Saying revolution, cut off their heads.
Off with their heads, yeah. Phumlani.
Ramona, you say the ANC, the EFF and MK as charterist parties, but you don't mention the DA, who are World Economic Forum charterist party. So everyone's got their sort of view of of how things should be according to their particular ideology. And a lot of those who are in charge or might be in charge very soon, I don't think they necessarily present the best options. So I think that's a point too. Look, grow the middle class, absolutely. That seems to be the only way. I very much think the future of South Africa is completely down to the black middle class. I've said this for a long time. You and I have had this conversation. The reality is, and it's an important thing what's happening now, because we had a lot of economic growth for the best part of 20 years. And that economic growth led to, and if you read Moletsi and Becky's book or listen to anything he's sort of said in the past 10 years, you will hear that we had the largest economic growth of that sector. That was the group that mattered. So we went from having this narrative that Julius still goes on about, and those types of people, where the whites and the rich whites own everything. That's not really true. That's not a true statement anymore. We have a black middle class. Certainly there's that 2%, and we can talk about that 2%, but their race has really nothing to do with it. But the black middle class has risen up in this country in a very massive way, and to the point that there are 8 to 10 million people now. And the white middle class is half of that. So the truth is that group is the group that is the greatest hope for this country, because that group came, the chances are, to use leftist lingo, the white folks were probably privileged, right? So in other words, the kid who's 30 today doesn't know what it was to have nothing, the white kid. The black kid who's 30 today, who has a decent job and a middle class income, knows what it's like to have nothing, probably, all right, or was very close to it. And so now with a collapsing economy and a struggling country, those people can see what it's like to have, but they also know what it's like to have not, and they can also see themselves moving closer to have not. And those people are going to be a massive political influence, and are a massive political influence, because if you know anyone who's involved inside the ANC at this level, not at the top level, feeding at the trough, these are the types of conversations they will have. These are the types of debates. I have friends who are very linked in the ANC, and these are the conversations we have about, whether the ANC can sustain this, because they and their families and everyone they know have been raised into at least a level of decency and dignity. And now the question is whether that is going to completely be lost.
My greatest concern, Roman, there's a big talk, this is politics now. There's this talk about the opposition, that we are seeing the ANC becoming factional, Jacob Zuma starting his own MK party. We have so many choices in this election. There are so many people. Look, from whom we can choose
30,000 votes to get a guaranteed salary of 2 million rand a year, including the benefits. So, why not?
Why not? But what I want to get to here is that and this also touches on my ideology in a way. My concern is that as we see what's called this, because I think our democracy is very vibrant. There's a lot of people from politics, the opposition is very active. But my greatest concern is that I think if you take the ANC and you combine with the EFF, which I'm not in favor of, and you combine with the MK, you take all these parties that I would say from an ideological point of view, they are sort of left and left wing. They still make up the greater number compared to the parties who claim to be on the right or right center, right? This is what's called, what they call the moonshot, whatever, pact. So my concern, Roman, is that even if the ANC does weaken in this election, but I wish that its weakening would result into the rise or the numbers in terms of what's called the right and right center growing in South Africa, right, expanding, and the support in that space growing. It seems to me that, yes, there is that, we do have options that we have, that are options that we have that are an alternative to the ANC, but it's not what I would love to see. We are still largely in the country dominated by very much what I would call left-wing organizations and their supporters. If you take the left-wing organizations and when you sum up with their supporters, they are still dominant in the country. Hence, what I've been trying to do over the years has been to really pump up the idea of markets, personal responsibility and all those things, a free market economy, because I think we need that, in South Africa we need that stronger sort of initiative, not only from an analysis perspective, but also from politics as well. If we see our politics still being dominated by these sort of left-wing organizations, and I think we will still continue to face some struggles in our democracy, and that's going to affect the black middle class that you guys are talking about. Because I strongly believe that if you were to have guys like the EFF in power, that would be negative for the black middle class and for the economy in general, right?
Well, actually, we shouldn't be talking about a black middle class, because the middle class is black, overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
In fact, the number of black
but
people...
But they would not be good for...
No, the number of black people in the middle class was equal to whites, coloreds, and Indians in 1996, and is now sitting at many orders of magnitude bigger. So, but the question is, to the model that you were speaking about, which is the combination of the ANC and the EFF and the MK, they are going to constantly outpace the rest of the populace, because demographics is destiny, because all of their support base are having more kids than people who are in the middle class.
Having more what?
More children.
Or more kids.
And so that disparity is going to grow. Remember that white South Africans were 20% of the voting bloc in 1994. What are they down to now? It's about 12%?
11, something like
Yeah,
that.
around about that figure. And that's all about the fact that there's disparate population growth between whites and blacks in this country. And so we are not going to be able to solve the problem that you are speaking of.
Yeah.
Where our salvation will come, by the way, Roman, to address the points that Phumlani is raising.
My concern, yes.
Yeah, it's not going to come from an intellectual point of view in terms of the values that he's espousing, which I share, by the way. But it's far more likely to come from a religious framework if you can actually suitably mobilize, because this is an overwhelmingly religious country that we have. And if you can actually suitably mobilize that religious undertone which drives the majority of the country to get them to focus on emphasizing a moral framework for government, which then ultimately ends up shaping economic policy. Because if you have a moral government, a government that steals becomes anathema to the voting public. And I think that's where our salvation is going to come from. We've come up, so I mean, you and I both have very good ideas in terms of how to fix things that are broken in this economy, which, so I've written about them.
Do you have the stats around the religious?
I think something like
percentage?
Something like 82% of South Africa identifies as being God-fearing and religious. So it's a significant chunk. But does that get translated into the way in which they make voting decisions?
Well, it doesn't, because the ACDP polls at 2%. So yes, just to give you an idea.
But again, that's not the point of the ACDP. It's rather really the question of, are you able to get... that's why everyone makes the trek to Moriah, because the politicians, because they want to make sure that the ZCC is never turning around and saying, you will vote for this party. But we need to push them to the point where they are going to vote for a party that is not going to steal. It's a very basic measurement.
Yeah.
Vote for the party that doesn't steal.
I'm going to cut you off because we're going to go to the last question from Penwell.
Good evening. Sorry, Pen. I'm only taking the liberty to ask this question because you guys are discussing politics. Thank you very much for the conversations. Really appreciate it. If you guys may, you don't have to. Who are you voting for and why? And then secondly, who do you think the majority of South Africans who are poor black people should be voting for? Could be the same party, may not be. If you feel comfortable to answer the one and not the other, it's up to you. Thank you.
Phumlani.
Kanthan.
I'm going first. Okay.
Controversial question.
Okay, no, I've already been public on this. I've said this much on Twitter. For
X, please.
Come on. Okay. keep up with the times.
All right. So Jonathan wants us to talk about his exes. Right.
Yeah.
We'll. So I've already said that for the province, I'm going to vote for the DA. because the DAs are they're a competent managerial class, and at the provincial level, I'm going to vote for them.
And they racist? And they racist, the DA?
No, they're not racist. A racist is someone who hates you guys more than is necessary.
But I'm saying that's the narrative. Some people hold that narrative.
It's the last question.
Come on, pick that up and run with it. Tries to inject levity into it.
Sorry.
No,
DA provincially.
Yeah, I'm going to vote
because they're good administrators.
Yeah, they're good administrators. Yeah, so I'm going to vote for the DA provincially. At a national level, I'm still undecided. The only one right now who has anyway impressed me was Colleen McBella, and I'm very likely to end up voting for her, just simply because she's been talking a different narrative.
Okay. Where is that narrative funded from, may I ask? Do you know?
I don't care. I like the narrative.
Okay.
He's funding it.
Phumlani?
No, I would love to, panel, I'm not sure I want to answer specifically who I would vote for, but I will definitely...
My vote is my secret.
My vote is my secret. But I will definitely, I will definitely not vote for the guys who promote the idea of what EFF is promoting, MK Party and the ANC's incompetence that I think many people have seen over the years. So I'm definitely not going to go that route. So that's out of the way. But my vote is likely to be along the lines of what's called the Moonshot Pact. So that's where my vote is going to lie, whether it's nationally or provincially as well. Because I think, and what motivates me to do that is, it comes back to what I said earlier. I would love to see my dream of a South Africa where there is that vibrant sort of ideological debate as to how we should set policy and organize our society. That is, it does exist in many advanced democracies, right? And I would love us to see those, and I would love to see what's called the moonshot, or the multi-party charter doing quite well, because I would argue, at least in my observation, they are more right and right center. So you would have that, and then you would have the left and left, if there's any left center thing from the ANC and MK and wherever on the other side. But what's called the right and right center, it's very weak, Penwell, and I think we need to really strengthen it. Hence, that's what will motivate me to vote.
So you want balance.
Yeah, and it's also got some credible, very good people in that space who I think would make very good leaders, in my perspective.
You're going to answer Pen's second question, which is how would you tell the masses to vote?
Oh, definitely not vote for the guys I've just recommended. Vote how I vote.
No, you see, I would tell them don't vote.
No, you can't do that.
I would say don't vote, because your life is not going to change. Has your life changed to the past 30 years? Don't go to the polls.
No, but you see, can I push back against that? Because I think that's been a very dangerous narrative to tell people not to vote. Because Kanthan, the thing is, in a democracy, if their lives haven't changed for the better over the years, then they must give an opportunity to other people who can come and bring change, right? At least ask those people to bring change. Because we've been governed by one party for 30 years now. And I don't think, and you know very well of how our country has been declining under the ANC. So you can't tell people not to vote. Rather, tell them to go and vote for change and for an alternative. So I'm opposed to what you're saying now.
I'm happy for you to oppose it, but
and I'm upset.
But I insist on my right to free speech to tell people.
I insist on my right to oppose you.
Yeah. Oh. All right.
In fact, I will say to them, go and take the KFC and then go home.
Oh, that I would recommend always. Always take the free gifts from the politicians and then do whatever else you like. But so in terms of who to vote for, so maybe if you indulge me for a second. We don't have a democracy in South Africa. We like to say we do. Theoretically, on paper, we go to the polls every few years, locally and then nationally and provincially. But we don't have a democracy because there's two sides to democracy, and this is what's often not understood. So the one side is where the population goes to the polls and elects representatives, and that's the classic definition of democracy. The other side is where there is, again, consequence for the people who are elected, should they not fulfill the mandate the people have put them into power to fulfill. And we've never had a consequence for that. So we've had the same party in power for 30 years, and essentially they've suffered no consequence for any of their bad behavior. None. I mean, no, who suffered really? Tony Ngeni, he went to jail for a little bit, hey. But other than that, there's been nothing. So we haven't really had a democracy, and I think that's an important point, because even if you hate, for example, the DA, if you were to vote for the DA to be in power, and enough of the disenfranchised did vote for that group to be in power, and you let them have power for 5 years, and then you voted the ANC back in, you think the ANC would behave exactly the same way they did the next time they got power? And the answer is very simply no, right? The answer is that once you know you might actually get fired, you tend to behave a little bit better. Now, they're politicians, so they're never going to behave well, right? And you can see this in the United States. They create a uni-party, so especially where you have two-party systems, they just are basically the same as each other, but they pretend to be different. But if there's an idea that you can actually lose your job, and you can actually lose your access, because that's really what government in South Africa at the moment has become, it's access. If there's a chance of that, then you start having what looks like a democracy. So that's the first sort of comment in regards to the question. In terms of whom I'm going to vote for, I haven't decided yet, because I'm very conflicted. This was a much easier question 20 years ago, and a slightly easier question 10 years ago. So the issue I have is that I should typically vote for the DA, because I'm the white guy on the stage, and therefore I must be voting for the DA. But I have severe concerns about the DA. First of all, COVID, they behaved like Australian nannies, and I don't want Australian nannies running the South African government. I think that there are very big red flags with regards to that party and their belief that they can also control things in their own way that the ANC has already proved don't work. So I have worries about that. And there is a major internal conflict happening within that party, and you can speak to anyone in that party. They're very good at making sure it never gets out. That's why people leave, by the way. It's as soon as they raise their voices about the conflict that's going on. And the conflict that's going on is essentially between social democrats, socialists, who don't like to call themselves socialists, and between libertarians / classical liberals. And that's the big debate happening in the DA. And there's this constant friction in that party. And so when the party, for me, behaves like a classical liberal, I think, yeah, I could vote for that. And when they behave like social democrats, I want to run in the opposite direction. Now, when I look at the other options, I feel like Phumlani makes quite a good point. The EFF would never really be an option for me. I don't believe in their foundational principles. The ANC, I don't really believe in their foundational principles either, although they could fix themselves, by the way, if they got rid of people like Rob Davies. They might have a chance if they went more African nationalism than completely down the we want to be Russians. But they're not an option. Obviously, MK is a bit of a laugh. I'm not saying they won't get votes. I'm just saying they're a bit of a laugh. So that side of the spectrum, I don't really know. I heard a good comment actually from the Kifnus the other day, who said someone asked him what he thinks of Rise Mzansi, and he said something to the effect of, "I don't like opposition parties who only attack the opposition." And I thought that was a particularly good comment. So a lot of those new parties that have sprung up that seem to be knocking down the guys who might have a better opportunity at running the country than the guys who kind of made it worse, wouldn't really trust them. So I'm on the multi-party charter as well, and I would look at the parties. You know, you talk about the right. I mean, we barely have a right in this country. That's the truth. I mean, you know, right is it's a relative term. I mean, the Freedom Front Plus is probably the most right-wing party we have, them or the ACDP. And if you took that party to the United States, the Republicans would laugh at them. You know, so, and if you took them to somewhere like El Salvador right now, they would definitely be laughed at. Okay? The PA, okay, so the PA, my problem with the PA is that I can't trust Gayton, because Gayton says openly that he will get into bed with whoever is the right person at that time, and that might include the ANC or the EFF. And so I can't trust that, because I don't want the ANC or the EFF in government. And so if they give him whatever it is that he specifically wants, he may very well get into bed with them. So
did you endorse ACDP the other time on X?
So the reason why I am quite pro ACDP in some respects, pro the DA in some respects. I liked Colleen as well, by the way. Her interview on the Burning Platform was superb. And I've listened to all of them, and they've interviewed a lot of the political leaders. And it was between her and Mulder, I think it was it Mulder? For Freedom Front Plus, who were the two best interviewed so far. So that's sort of where I fall. I can't say a specific one. The ACDP were the only party who in the first year of COVID, which was 4 years ago, not 3 as I misstated earlier, were the only party in the first year said this is bullshit. Lockdown is very bad. We should not keep children out of schools. We should not be forcing masks onto people's faces. And we should not be mandating vaccines, which was in 2021. They were the first party to do that when it was not popular to do that at all. And they did that on what seemed to be principled grounds. And so you have to give them credit for that. Whether that would make you vote for them, I don't know. I know a lot of people are put off by things like they're against abortion, but abortion's not going away, folks. It's basically enshrined in our constitution. So even if they were to run the country, they'd have to have 66%. Can anyone see a situation in which the ACDP has a 66% majority? I don't think so. So, yeah, it's the DA, it's the ACDP, maybe Colleen. I'd have to look a bit more at her policies, and the rest of the multi-party charter. And how would I tell the rest to vote? Exactly like me. So, we must call it quits because I think we're running out of hard drive space. But thank you everyone for joining us.
Pleasure.
Phumlani, a pleasure as always. Kanthan, I'll see you next week.
That's very possible. I just want to point out that both of us have a limited number of copies of our books available on sale.
I knew it was coming.
Grab them while you can.
Yes.
Excellent.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you everyone for joining us.